Dr. Padalekar, Chairman of the session, and all the distinguished panel members, DG Sanjaz, and all participants of the seminar, and of course, ladies and gentlemen in the audience. Firstly, good morning, and thank you again to Sanjaz for giving me this opportunity to participate here. I would also like to place on record my grateful acknowledgement to the Naval History Division, who helped me in researching and putting together this presentation. So I will be talking about the first before we go into the past, and that is the post-independence Navy. And I will talk through a tale of 20 pictures. Keep it interesting for the audience. Okay. So Dr. Padalekar mentioned, about Chirantar and Nirantar, and there was no doubt that in the pre-colonial period, India was a great seafaring nation. We had a great shipbuilding tradition, and of course, great commerce and trade linkages with all the then civilizational powers. And in that sense, we could say that in the medieval period and before, the Indian Ocean and of course the wider Indo-Pacific was truly a free and open Indian Ocean. So in that sense, what the Indian Navy has attempted to do post-1947 is to reclaim this legacy and restore the Indian Ocean to a free and open nature that it always existed. As Dr. Padalekar said, it was the normal state of affairs before we became abnormal for about 500 years. So in that sense, I would cover how the Indian Navy has gone about this task post-independence in about 4 acts. As a post-colonial flag bearer, the preferred security partner, a first responder, and of course, a collaborative security contributor. So at the time of independence, the Indian Navy was in a bit of strife because at partition, whilst the ships were divided 60-40 between India and Pakistan, a lot of the vital infrastructure as well as most of the trained manpower migrated to the fledgling Pakistan Navy. So therefore, we were literally left with a Navy that had more ships than men. But this did not deter our founding fathers. In fact, they were determined to restore the power of the Indian Navy. And the first thing that they did was to buy 2 Royal Navy light cruisers, HMS Nigeria and HMS Argonaut. They were rechristened INS Delhi, who you can see on in this picture here, and INS Mysore. And they became the flagships of the fledgling Indian Navy, showing the tricolor across the globe. In fact, in spite of the unequal distribution, our visionary founding fathers had already decided that strategic air power was also required, and the plans for induction of the first aircraft carrier INS Vikrant were already underway. So after independence, the Indian Navy took her task of maritime diplomacy extremely seriously. It was a time when India was reaching out to all its partners in the Indian Ocean region and trying to act as a force for global decolonization. And this photograph is extremely historic, taken in 1951 on board the quarterdeck of INS Delhi in Mombasa Harbour. And it shows the famous tall Kenyan leader who was ultimately the Prime Minister and then the President of Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta. He was hosted on a reception on board INS Delhi. He was given a guard of honor, and all this happened 12 years before Kenya even got independence from the British. So this showed how the Indian Navy and India had already realized that it was the tall indigenous African leaders who actually represented the African people. And that's why this reception was held. And Jomo Kenyatta famously said, the last time I was on a British cruiser, I was part of the chipping party. The chipping party are the guys who maintain the ship. And this time I'm the chief guest. Thank you so much for your kindness. He was extremely moved. But of course, the colonial legacy could never actually be put to rest until such time that we remove the last vestiges of the colonial power from our own territory. And this photograph of the Alfonso de Albuquerque, who was the flagship of the Portuguese Navy, off Panjim, when she engaged in a gun battle with INS Betwa and Bias in 1961, was the commencement of the liberation of Goa operations. And that was the time that India actually restored this colonial anomaly through 2 operations, Operation Vijay, which was an armed forces operation, and Operation Chutney, which was exclusively to the naval operation. Of course, chutney being the idea that we'll make chutney out of them, which was actually achieved and this saw the sunset of the colonial era in India. And then I jump almost 60 years down the line to a very interesting photograph taken of an Indian sailing vessel, INS Tarangani, entering Thames and London Harbour in 2022 as part of the Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, 75 years of independence. And what could be more symbolic than an Indian sailing vessel flying the tricolour, sailing up the Thames into the capital of the erstwhile colonial power, truly showing that the Indian Navy had transformed from a colonial offshoot to a globally respected maritime force. Another very interesting photograph taken in 2017 when our then Chief of the Naval Staff, Admiral Sunil Lamba, presented a hydrographic chart of the Gulf of Tanga to the Tanzanian authorities. Now, Tanga is a location, is a port in Tanzania, which was the site of a not so well-known World War I battle, wherein the British from Kenya tried to invade the Germans who were in Tanzania. It was a fiasco. Of course, the British lost that battle, but thousands of Indian soldiers sacrificed their lives on behalf of the British. So this was a symbolic gesture almost more than 100 years after the event. The naval chief of an independent India presenting a hydrographic chart which was made by the technological skill of the newly independent Indian Navy to an independent Tanzania, thus wiping away the slate of colonialism and also showing that ships and technology alone do not count for a navy. It is also the legacy of those who have gone before us, who laid their lives for the nation, and in remembrance of that, I think this photograph has a lot to say. During the Cold War, the Indian Ocean was more or less a zone of peace, and maritime security was not to the fore. So therefore, the decades soon after independence saw the Indian Navy slowly and gradually grow in power. But in the 1980s, things changed. And it was in the mid-1980s that the Indian Navy was thrust into the global maritime consciousness as the preferred security partner of the littoral countries. And this photograph, taken on board the helideck of INS Godavari in 1988, shows the coup leader, the mercenary coup leader of an attempted coup in the Maldives. When he tried to overthrow a democratically elected government, President Gayoom of Maldives appealed to India for help. We carried out a decisive military intervention and thwarted this coup attempt. The coup leader and his contemporaries tried to flee by sea by capturing a merchant vessel. In a very calibrated operation, INS Godavari fired upon the vessel, forced it to stop, and captured these mercenaries, and therefore showed this was the first operation in maritime security terms where Indian Navy showed itself as a first responder and as a stalwart partner for its neighbors. It was after this operation that Time magazine published in its global edition this cover of India and the Indian Navy as the next military power. Jump forward about 10 years and piracy had now reared its head up in Southeast Asia. The Straits of Malacca was rife with piracy. And a Japanese merchant vessel, MV Alondra Rainbow, was hijacked and captured by the pirates, and they were attempting to commandeer it towards the West Asian region when the Indian Navy was alerted. She swung into action, 3 ships, INS Delhi, the new INS Delhi, INS Gomti, both of them seen in this picture surrounding the merchant vessel, and the third vessel, INS Prahar, who actually carried out decisive kinetic intervention by firing his guns upon the merchant vessel, forcing it to stop. In fact, the pirates were so scared that they scuttled the merchant vessel and surrendered. But the uniqueness of this photograph is that it shows right at front and center the new INS Delhi. The old INS Delhi was a hand-me-down from the colonial power. The new INS Delhi, designed and built in Mazagon Dockyard in India, truly showing our transformation from a buyer's navy to a builder's navy. And of course, this operation thereafter became quite famous because it was the first anti-piracy operation that we conducted. But the pirates were not going away anywhere. Whilst in Malacca Straits, with the help of the ASEAN navies, we were able to quell the piracy problem. But off the coast of Somalia in 2008, this piracy problem emerged once again. And when it reared its head, we saw Upstart Valor. This was the first major merchant vessel that was hijacked with Indian seafarers on board. And the Indian Navy was again tasked, and she carried out anti-piracy patrols in the Gulf of Aden from 2008 till date. And not a single merchant vessel which has been convoyed by the Indian Navy has ever been captured by the pirates. They have tried, they have attacked, but they have never captured. And this photograph shows a large number of pirates who were captured on board the hello deck of INS Khabar, and it was around this period that piracy actually saw a major dip thanks to the actions of the Indian Navy off the coast of Somalia. Fast forward further, 2024, and piracy again, as the Houthis were intervening in the Red Sea, piracy again reared its head off the coast of Somalia. MV Ruin was captured by the pirates and was heading towards Somalia. Indian naval ship Kolkata was tasked to interdict, and she headed off this merchant vessel about almost 2,000 kilometers far away from the Indian coast. And you can see in an extremely daring operation, well calibrated, she first forced the merchant ship to stop, and thereafter we carried out a combat free fall of the marine commandos of the Indian Navy, which you can see in the photograph. And the combined action of the ship and the marine commandos took control of the ship. The boarding party captured the pirates, and the rest is history. MV Ruin became a very, very famous symbol of the Indian Navy protecting sea lanes in the Indian Ocean region. We have always, as well since the time of independence, had a legacy of compassion. And as a first responder in the Indian Ocean region for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, we started small. Even in the 1950s, when foreign merchant vessels asked for help, we had occasions like INS Teed and INS Kisna, who sailed out rapidly to render assistance to ships from Singapore and the US. But it was in 2004, when the tsunami struck Indian Ocean, that the Indian Navy actually came to the forefront. In spite of the fact that we had also had extensive damage in the coast of Tamil Nadu and Andaman and Nicobar, we still launched our ships across for relief operations, and this shows INS Magar, carrying out these relief operations. Operation Mother again brought us to the forefront for HADR. Thereafter, in the first 2 decades of this century, we saw the Indian Navy carrying out extensive evacuation operation, lifeline and conflict zones in Lebanon, Libya and Yemen. The Yemen Operation Rahat saw 5,000 people being evacuated, including 1,900 foreign nationals, and I was closely associated as a defense attaché in Oman, so I saw this operation firsthand. And of course, during COVID, when the world was in lockdown, it was the Indian Navy, through its Operation Samudra Setu, that actually brought home more than 4,000 Indians from different countries and also delivered food and vaccines across the region to our maritime neighbors. But the Indian Navy also, right from independence, realized that maritime partnerships are essential for collaborative security. We started with exercises with the Commonwealth navies, what we used to call the joint exercise at Trincomalee, started very small. Thereafter, worked with the larger navies, the Americans and the French, through the Malabar exercises, which started in the 90s, the Varuna exercise, which again started in the 90s, and finally, we started our very own homegrown multinational exercise called Exercise Milan, which started in 1995 with only 4 nations, but has now grown to over 40 nations, more than 20 warships participating, a host of exercises, and again shows how we transitioned from a small navy, which was dependent upon the colonial hand-downs, to an independent source of our maritime sovereignty. Of course, the Indian Navy is also actively involved as a capability enhancer, training so many of our fellow maritime professionals across the Indian Ocean region, modernizing their navies and sharing expertise. And to conclude, all I can say is that the lesson and the legacy of the past continues to drive the Indian Navy, and the Indian Navy remains a force for stability, security, and partnerships in the Indian Ocean region. Thank you so much.